The air inside the massive workshop was thick, smelling heavily of burned oil, hot rubber, and the metallic temps of anxiety. It was a heavy, suffocating scent that usually meant money was being lost by the second. Outside, the rain lashed against the high, grime-streaked windows, but inside, the storm was entirely man-made. Dozens of men in pristine uniforms or press suits were shouting over the roar of compressors, their faces flushed with frustration. In the dead center of the chaos sat the reason. For all the noise, the V-12 Hyperion. It was a thing of terrifying beauty, a sleek silver prototype engine that represented the future of the company. It was also currently a very expensive, very heavy paperweight. It hadn't started in 3 days, and the deadline for the international showcase was breathing down everyone's necks. Alina stood near the back wall, leaning against a stack of heavy pallets. She was 22 years old, with hair pulled back in a messy, practical ponytail, and wearing coveralls that were 2 sizes too big for her. To the rushing executives and the frantic engineers, she was invisible. She was just the intern who fetched coffee, swept the floors, and kept out of the way. But Alina wasn't just watching the drama. She was listening to the engine. She could feel the wrongness of it in her teeth, a sort of synthetic vibration that the machine gave off even when it was silent. She had been watching the chief engineer, a man with a gray mustache and a temper shorter than a fuse, try to recalibrate the timing belt for the last hour. He had thrown his wrench down 10 minutes ago and stormed out, claiming the physics of the engine were flawed. He had quit on the spot, leaving a vacuum of power that the boss was about to fill with pure rage. That boss, Mr. Sterling, burst through the double doors at that exact moment. The room went instantly quiet, save for the dripping of a leaky pipe somewhere in the ceiling. Sterling was a man who looked like he was carved from granite and expensive wool. He didn't walk. He stalked, his eyes scanning the room for someone to blame. He stopped in front of the silent engine, his face turning a shade of purple that didn't look healthy. "What is the meaning of this?" Sterling bellowed, his voice echoing off the metal walls. "I pay you people fortunes to build miracles, and you give me a statue?" The mechanics shifted their weight, looking at their boots. No one wanted to be the one to tell him that his multi-million-dollar design might be trash. The silence stretched, tense and uncomfortable. Alina, however, couldn't help herself. She knew the engine wasn't trash. The design was brilliant, but the assembly was slightly off in a way that standard tools couldn't detect. She took a small step forward, her eyes fixed on the engine block, not the man. "It's not the design," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the quiet room, it cut through the air like a knife. Every head turned. Sterling turned slowly, scanning the faces of his top engineers before his eyes dropped down, and landed on her. He looked at the oversized coveralls, the grease on her chin, and the youth in her eyes. He didn't see a mechanical prodigy. He saw a kid who didn't know her place. "And who are you?" Sterling asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Alina, I'm an intern," she replied, not backing down. "The camshaft timing is fighting the thermal expansion rate. It's not mechanical failure. It's a resonance issue. You have to shim the injectors by about 2 millimeters. Sterling let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. He looked around the room for support, expecting the other men to laugh with him. A few gave nervous chuckles, but the lead mechanic just looked at Alina with a squint, his brain working behind his eyes. "A resonance issue," Sterling mocked, walking up to her. He loomed over her, using his height to try and intimidate her. "We have PhDs and 50 years of combined experience in this room working on this, and you, an intern, think you know the answer because of a feeling? It's not a feeling. It's math," Alina said simply. She pointed a calloused finger at the engine. "If you listen to the idle attempt, the pistons are lagging by microseconds." "It's enough," Sterling snapped. He was in a foul mood, and he needed a target. He needed to prove that he was in control, and taking an experienced girl down a peg seemed like the perfect way to assert dominance. "This is a precision machine, not a toy you fix with a hammer and duct tape. You're sweeping floors, Alina. Stay in your lane." He turned back to the group of men. "Since my chief of engineering decided to abandon us, I want solutions, not guesses from the cleaning staff." Alina felt a hot spark of anger in her chest. She hated being looked down on, especially when she knew she was right. She had grown up in a garage filled with her father's broken-down trucks. She had rebuilt her first transmission when she was 12, reading manuals by flashlight because her family couldn't afford the repairs. She knew engines better than she knew people. Engines didn't lie. They didn't care what you looked like or how much money you had. They either worked or they didn't. This one wanted to work. It just needed help. "I can fix it," Alina said, her voice steady and calm. The room went dead silent again. Sterling turned back to her slowly, a dangerous smirk playing on his lips. He saw an opportunity to crush her completely. "You." He laughed, a cold, dry sound. "You think you can fix the impossible engine?" "Yes. Give me 1 hour." "Maybe 2, she said. Sterling stepped closer, invading her personal space. The smell of his cologne was overpowering. "Do you have any idea what you're offering? If you touch that machine and break a seal, or scratch a piston, you're not just fired. I will blacklist you from this industry. You will never pump gas in this town again." Alina didn't blink. "If I fix it, the internship is over. You hire me as a junior tech?" The mechanics in the room gasped softly. It was audacious. It was borderline insane. Sterling looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw the determination in her eyes, the lack of fear, the stubborn set of her jaw. He didn't believe for a second that she could do it. To him, it was like a hamster challenging a lion to a fight. But it was entertaining. It would relieve the tension in the room to watch her fail publicly. "Fine," Sterling said, spreading his arms wide. He unclipped his expensive watch and checked the time, then held it up for her to see. "You have 45 minutes. I have a board meeting to get to. If this engine doesn't turn over, you're out. And I expect you to clear out your desk before the sun goes down." He turned to the lead mechanic. "Give her the keys." "Let's see the show." The mechanic hesitated, looking at the engine, then at his boss, then at the small young woman standing before the beast. He walked over, keys jingling in his hand. He leaned in close to Alina, speaking low so the boss wouldn't hear. "Listen, kid," he whispered. "The computer diagnostic says the fuel pressure is maxed out. If you try to adjust it without the safety protocols, it could backfire." Alina took the keys from his hand, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. She looked him in the eye. "The computer is assuming the tolerances are standard," she whispered back. "They aren't. Trust me." She didn't wait for a reply. She turned and walked toward the Hyperion. The crowd of men parted, forming a wide circle around her. It felt like a gladiator arena. Alina rolled up the sleeves of her coveralls, revealing slender, scarred forearms. She took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the oil and metal, and let her mind go blank. The noise of the room, the boss's impatient tapping foot, the rain outside, it all faded away. There was only the machine. She reached out and touched the cold side of the engine block. She didn't grab a wrench or a computer tablet. She just placed her hand flat against the metal, feeling for the heartbeat of the car. The boss shouted something about time starting, but she didn't hear him. She was already gone, lost in the complex. Beautiful world of gears and pistons, seeing the solution in her mind with perfect clarity, ready to show them all that the impossible was just a problem that hadn't been solved yet. The sound of a pocket watch clicking shut echoed through the silent workshop like a gunshot. Sterling had made a show of checking the time, holding the gold watch up to the fluorescent lights to ensure everyone knew the countdown had begun. He leaned back against a tool cart, crossing his arms over his expensive suit, a smirk playing on his lips. He looked like a man waiting for a punchline to a joke he had already heard. Around the perimeter of the workshop, the atmosphere was heavy with secondhand embarrassment. The senior mechanics exchanged sideways glances, some shaking their heads slowly. They knew the complexity of the Hyperion. They knew the millions of dollars of sensors and computer modeling that had failed to solve the problem. Watching a 22-year-old intern walk up to that beast with nothing but her hands felt like watching a toddler try to defuse a bomb. Alina, however, felt none of their judgment. As she stepped onto the metal grate surrounding the engine, the noise of the room seemed to drop away, replaced by the steady thumping of her own heart. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at the man with the gold watch. She looked only at the machine. She ran her fingers along the side of the engine block. The metal was still warm from the failed attempts earlier that day. To anyone else, it was just a lump of metal and plastic. To Alina, it was a living thing that was in pain. She closed her eyes for a moment and listened not with her ears, but with her memory. She remembered her father's garage, the way he used to press his ear against the hood of a broken-down sedan to hear the rhythm of the pistons. He had taught her that engines have a language. They hum when they are happy, hiss when they are angry, and knock when they are dying. This engine wasn't dead. It was choking. She opened her eyes and reached for the heavy, rubberized protective gloves lying on the workbench. "You don't want those?" Sterling called out, his voice sharp and loud. It broke her concentration for a split second. The heat shield requires a torque wrench calibrated to specific Newton meters. "Don't strip the threads." Alina paused, her hand hovering over the gloves. She didn't turn around. "I need to feel the feedback," she said softly. "Rubber won't tell me what the metal is feeling." She bypassed the gloves and grabbed a flathead screwdriver and a simple wrench from the tray. A ripple of murmurs went through the group of mechanics. Stripping the threads on a titanium alloy block was a fireable offense. Sterling's smirk widened. He was sure she was about to destroy the engine and prove his point. Alina leaned in close to the intake manifold. The space was tight, designed for robotic arms, not human hands. She maneuvered the wrench into a spot that looked impossible to reach. Her knuckles scraping against the sharp edges of the engine bay, a tiny bead of blood welled up on her hand, but she didn't flinch. She gritted her teeth and applied pressure. Nothing happened. The bolt was stuck tight, likely seized by the intense heat from the previous test runs. "She's going to break it." One of the engineers whispered loudly enough for her to hear. Alina blocked out the voice. She visualized the inside of the bolt. She pictured the threads locking together, the metal expanding. She stopped trying to force it and instead tapped the wrench gently with the palm of her other hand. Asterisk, tap, tap. Tap, asterisk. It was a rhythm her father had used. A gentle persuasion rather than a brute force attack. On the third tap, she felt the bolt give a microscopic fraction. She smiled, just a little, and began to turn it. Slowly, painstakingly, the bolt loosened. She worked it out until it clattered into the tray below. 10 minutes had passed. Sterling checked his watch again, tapping his foot impatiently. "We have a schedule to keep," he barked. "If you're just going to take things apart, I can hire a 6-year-old to do that." Alina ignored him. She was peering into the dark, oily recess of the engine now. She reached in with her bare fingers, probing the darkness. The other saw a mess of wires and tubes. She saw the problem. It was a small sensor, barely the size of a coin, lodged slightly out of position. It wasn't broken, but it was misaligned by maybe a millimeter. It was enough to fool the computer into thinking the pressure was wrong, which caused the computer to shut down the engine to protect it. The computer is trying to protect the engine from a ghost. She muttered to herself. She pulled her hand out and wiped the grease on her coveralls. She looked around the workbench for a specific tool. She saw high-tech laser calipers and digital diagnostic scanners worth more than her car. She ignored them all. Her eyes landed on a simple roll of metal tape and a box of thin washers. The lead mechanic, a grizzled veteran who had been watching her with a mixture of pity and confusion, stepped forward. He couldn't hold his tongue anymore. "Kid, that's not how we fix it. You need to remap the ECU. The software controls the fuel mixture. You can't fix a software problem with a washer." Alina looked at him. Her eyes were calm, clear, and intensely focused. There was no arrogance in her look, only a deep certainty. "The software is reading the wrong data because the sensor is vibrating," she explained, her voice steady. "The mount is too rigid. It's shaking at high frequencies. I just need to dampen that vibration. The computer is smart, but it doesn't have common sense." She took a washer and a small piece of the metal tape. She crouched down, disappearing behind the massive engine block. The crowd strained their necks to see what she was doing. All they could hear was the soft tear of tape and the metallic clink. Of the washer being placed, Sterling rolled his eyes so hard it looked painful. "This is a waste of time," he announced to the room. "I've seen enough. When she's done playing arts and crafts, have security escort her out." He turned to leave, walking toward the glass-walled office overlooking the floor. But he didn't leave. He stopped at the glass door, his hand on the handle, waiting to hear the sound of failure. Inside the circle, Alina was making the final adjustment. It required a delicate touch. She had to wedge the washer into a tiny gap while holding the sensors steady. Her hands were slippery with oil, and her muscles were beginning to tremble from the awkward angle. She held her breath, her world shrinking down to the size of that tiny metal ring. Slide. Click, it fit perfectly. She let her breath out in a long, slow exhale. She reversed her steps, tightening the bolt she had removed, careful not to over-tighten it. She wiped her hands on a rag, leaving dark streaks on the cloth, and stood up. She looked at the mess of tools she had, used primitive things compared to the machine they served. She reached for the key, which was sitting on the top of the engine block. The room was deadly silent. The mechanics weren't whispering anymore. They were watching, sensing a shift in the atmosphere that they couldn't quite explain. The lead mechanic stared at the engine, his mind racing. He knew the theory she had just applied. He had read about it in textbooks 30 years ago. But he had never seen anyone actually do it in the field. Especially not with a roll of tape and 10 minutes to spare. Alina looked up and caught Sterling's gaze through the glass wall. He was glaring at her, checking his watch again. He held up 5 fingers, indicating 5 minutes left. She didn't nod. She didn't smile. She simply turned back to the machine, placed the key in the ignition, and rested her hand on the shifter. The engine sat there, a silent silver beast waiting to wake up. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like the air would crack. Everyone knew that if this didn't work, a career was over. But for the first time since the crisis began, Alina felt a strange sense of peace. She knew the engine. She had fixed its pain. Now, she just had to ask it to sing. The second hand on the clock swept past the 12, marking the end of the 10-minute deadline. Sterling stepped out from the glass office, his expression dark and triumphant. He walked with the slow, heavy gait of a man who is about to fire someone, but is drawing it out for the dramatic effect. The mechanics parted instinctively as he approached, creating a clear path to the center of the workshop. "Time is up, Alina," Sterling announced, his voice cutting through the silence. He didn't look at her directly. He looked at his watch, then at the silent engine, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "I told you this wasn't a game. You've wasted enough of our day. Step away from the vehicle." He extended a hand, palm open, expecting her to hand over the key. The message was clear. Give up now, with whatever dignity you have left, or be dragged out by security. But Alina didn't move. She stood with her hand resting on the warm hood of the car, her fingers tracing the sleek metal. She didn't look at the boss, and she didn't look at the clock. She was focused entirely on the schematic in her mind. The final checks she needed to run before she risked turning the ignition. It was a silence that felt disrespectful to him, and his jaw tightened. "Did you hear me?" Sterling snapped, his voice rising an octave. "I said step away. You are not authorized to start that engine." Finally, Alina turned. She looked tired. There were smudges of grease on her cheek and shadows under her eyes, but her gaze was steady and unbroken. It was the look of someone who knows something the rest of the world doesn't. "I just need to verify the fuel sync," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It will take 30 seconds. If I walk away now, the system will default back to the error code. You'll have to start from scratch tomorrow." Sterling let out a short, sharp laugh. He looked around at his team, hoping to see them smirking with him, but he found only concerned faces. Even the most skeptical engineers were looking at the engine, then at her, trying to figure out what she had actually done under the hood. "Verify the fuel sync?" Sterling mocked, using a high-pitched, whining tone to imitate her. "With what? A wrench and a prayer? Do you have any idea how much computing power is in that car? It requires a master's degree just to understand the dashboard." Alina ignored the insult. She turned back to the engine and reached for a small tablet connected to the car's diagnostic port. She tapped the screen, bringing up a stream of numbers that looked like gibberish to the untrained eye. Sterling watched over her shoulder, his breath hot on her neck. "If you fry that ECU, I will garnish your wages for the rest of your life," he whispered threateningly. "The electronic control unit is fine," she murmured, mostly to herself. "It's just confused." It was getting feedback from the vibration sensor. It thought the engine was knocking, so it cut the fuel pump. She tapped a command on the screen. "Initialize sequence." "She's adjusting the fuel map," the lead mechanic whispered from the back of the crowd. His eyes had gone wide. He was staring at the tablet, watching the numbers change. "That's not factory standard." She's bypassing the governor." Sterling whipped around. "Stop her. She's going to blow the intake." "She's not blowing anything," the mechanic argued, stepping forward, drawn to the screen like a moth to a flame. "Look at the timing curves. They're smooth. I've never seen a curve that smooth on this prototype." Sterling looked back at the tablet, but the numbers meant nothing to him. He only saw dollar signs and potential disasters. He didn't understand that Alina wasn't using the computer to control the engine. She was using the computer to ask the engine for permission to start. She was negotiating a truce between the metal and the machine. "It's not just the vibration," Alina continued, her fingers flying across the screen. She wasn't talking to the boss anymore. She was explaining it to the room, to the mechanics who lived and breathed this stuff. "The thermal expansion on the block is uneven. The left bank heats up faster than the right. The computer tries to compensate by retarding the timing, but it overcompensates. So I locked the timing to a manual variance based on temperature slope." The room fell into a stunned silence. It was a sentence that should have come from a textbook, not from a 22-year-old in dirty coveralls. It was a solution that was so simple in theory, yet so difficult to execute, that no one had even tried it. They had assumed the computer was smarter than them. Alina knew that sometimes you have to outsmart the computer. "Slope variance." Sterling sputtered. "You locked the timing? Manually? That's impossible. The software won't allow it." Alina hit the final key. "Override accepted?" "It allows it if you tell it the sensor is faulty," she said softly. "And if you give it a new set of parameters to work with?" She straightened up and unplugged the tablet. She tossed it gently onto a nearby tool cart. The sound echoed through the room. It was done. There was nothing left to do but turn the key. The anticipation in the workshop was physically heavy. It felt like the air pressure had dropped. The rain was still battering the roof, a rhythmic drumming that seemed to count down the seconds. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the silver car. The security guards who had been called to escort Alina out were standing by the door, frozen in place, unsure if they should interrupt or watch. Sterling's face was a mask of conflicting emotions. He wanted her to fail. He needed her to fail, because if she succeeded, it meant he was wrong. It meant that his vision for the company, his reliance on technology and degrees and status, was flawed. It meant that the person he had treated like a nuisance was the only one who actually knew what she was doing. "Go ahead then," Sterling said, his voice strangely quiet. He crossed his arms, his fingers digging into his biceps. "Let's get this over with." Alina took a deep breath. She settled into the driver's seat. The leather was cold against her back. She wrapped her fingers around the steering wheel, feeling the texture of the grip. For a moment, she just sat there. She remembered the nights she spent studying engine diagrams by candlelight because the electricity was out. She remembered the ridicule she faced in shop class, the teachers who told her to go home and study cooking. She felt the weight of all that doubt, and then she let it go. She pushed the clutch pedal down. It felt stiff, mechanical, and real. She moved the gear stick into neutral. She turned the key. The engine didn't roar to life immediately. First, there was a click. Then, a whir of the fuel pump priming. The lights on the dashboard flickered to life in a dance of colors. Sterling held his breath. The mechanics leaned in. Then came the sound. It started low, a deep rumble in the belly of the machine. It grew louder, vibrating the floor, the tools on the benches, and the bones of the people watching. It wasn't the sputtering, coughing sound they had heard for the past week. It was the sound of 12 pistons moving in perfect harmony. It was the sound of power. Alina feathered the gas pedal. The engine note climbed, a high-pitched scream that sounded like a jet fighter taking off. She revved it once, twice, 3 times. The needle on the tachometer danced up to the red line and snapped back down, instantly responsive. There was no lag. There was no hesitation. The engine was alive. She let it settle back into a smooth, purring idle. She looked up through the windshield, seeing the reflection of the workshop lights on the glass. She didn't cheer. She didn't jump up and down. She just smiled a small private smile. She knew. Outside, the silence was deafening. No one spoke. They just stared at the car, listening to the hum of the impossible engine. Sterling stood rooted to the spot, his face pale, his arms slowly uncrossing and hanging limp at his sides. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, or perhaps a man who had just seen his future arrive in a form he never expected. The sound of the engine settled into a rhythm that was unlike anything the workshop had ever heard. It wasn't the erratic, sputtering cough of a dying machine, nor the deafening roar of an uncontrolled explosion. It was a steady, humming vibration that felt more like a heartbeat than machinery. The sound seemed to resonate inside the chests of everyone standing there, a deep, thrumming bass that rattled the loose screws on the tool benches and vibrated the coffee in the paper cups sitting on the rail. For a long moment, nobody moved. The mechanics stood frozen, their eyes wide, staring at the silver car as if it had suddenly transformed into a living creature. Even the security guards near the door had lowered their radios. The usual static forgotten as they listened to the impossible purr of the V-12 inside the car. Alina kept her hand lightly on the gear stick. She watched the dashboard lights. The check engine light was off. The oil pressure gauge was steady in the green, and the temperature gauge was climbing slowly, exactly as it should. There was no fluctuation, no jittering needles. The computer brain of the car and the mechanical heart were finally in agreement. She let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 3 days and gently revved the engine again. The response was instant. The needle swept up the dial and snapped back down with a precision that made the lead mechanic gasp audibly. Sterling stood a few feet away, his face drained of color. He uncrossed his arms and took a stumbling step backward, his heel catching on a cable on the floor. He caught himself on a workbench, but his eyes never left the car. He looked like a man who had just watched a ghost walk through a wall. The confident smirk, the arrogance, the cruel certainty of 10 minutes ago had all evaporated, leaving behind a man who was struggling to process reality. The silence in the room broke, not with a cheer, but with a collective exhale. It started with the mechanics. One by one, they stepped closer, circling the vehicle like worshippers approaching a shrine. They were pointing at the engine block, their voices low and hushed. "Listen to that idle," a senior technician whispered, his voice filled with awe. "It's smoother than the test bench unit." "How is that possible?" "It's the timing," the lead mechanic muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. "She actually balanced the thermal expansion. I thought she was crazy when she mentioned it. She manually compensated for the heat."
Ow!
Sterling pushed himself off the workbench, his composure struggling to return. He straightened his jacket, though his hands were trembling slightly. He walked up to the driver's side window, his shadow falling over Alina. She looked up, her expression calm, almost bored. She reached out and turned the key. The engine died instantly. The sudden silence feeling heavier and louder than the noise had been. The sudden quiet rang in everyone's ears. Sterling cleared his throat. The sound was harsh and awkward in the quiet room. "That could have been a fluke," he said, though his voice lacked its usual bite. It sounded weak, defensive. "It wasn't," Elena said. She opened the car door and stepped out, pulling off the oversized coveralls to reveal a simple t-shirt and jeans underneath. She wiped her hands on a rag, grease still staining her fingers. "The fuel map is stable. The timing is locked. You can run it for the next 6 hours straight, and it won't overheat. You can run it tomorrow, and it will do the same." She moved to the front of the car and leaned down to unlatch the hood. With a heavy clunk, the hood popped up. Sterling and the mechanics leaned in as she raised it. She pointed to a spot deep inside the engine bay, near the firewall. "You see that sensor there?" she asked. The vibration isolator was worn down. It was sending phantom data to the computer. The computer thought the engine was shaking itself apart, so it kept cutting the ignition to save the motor. The lead mechanic squeezed in, peering where she pointed. He reached in with a flashlight, his eyes widening as he saw the small makeshift shim she had fashioned. He looked at the cheap metal washer and the tape, then he looked at the millions of dollars of surrounding technology. He started to laugh. It was a genuine, surprised laugh. "A shim," he chuckled. "We replaced the entire fuel rail system. We changed the ECU twice. We spent 50 grand on diagnostic testing. And it was a 50-cent vibration problem." Sterling stared at the washer. The reality of the situation was washing over him like a cold wave. He had berated her. He had humiliated her. He had threatened her livelihood. And she had saved his project, his reputation, and likely his company's stock price, using a piece of scrap metal, an understanding of physics that his highly paid experts had lacked. The atmosphere in the workshop shifted completely. The mechanics were no longer looking at Alina with pity or amusement. They were looking at her with respect. A few of the younger techs were nodding at her, impressed by the quiet confidence she displayed. They knew how hard it was to stand up to Sterling. They knew how hard it was to fix an engine that everyone else had given up on. She had walked through the fire and come out clean on the other side. Sterling turned to face her, his expression complicated. It was a mix of humiliation, grudging respect, and a dawning realization that he had made a terrible mistake. He looked at the grease on her hands, the smudge on her cheek, and the directness in her eyes. He realized he wasn't talking to an intern or a janitor. He was talking to a master craftsman who just happened to be young. "The board is waiting," Sterling said quietly. "The showcase is tomorrow morning." "I know," Alina replied, tossing the rag onto the tool cart. "You didn't just start it," Sterling continued, his voice dropping so only she and the lead mechanic could hear. "You balanced it. I've never heard that engine run like that. Not even on the simulator." He paused, looking back at the car, then at her. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a heavy, humbled curiosity. "Who are you, really? You didn't learn that in a classroom." Lena leaned against the side of the car, crossing her arms. "My dad was a mechanic," she said simply. "We didn't have a lot of money. If something broke, we couldn't pay to fix it. We had to understand it. We had to listen to it. Make do with what we had. He taught me that machines aren't smart. They just follow rules. If you know the rules better than the machine does, you can make it do whatever you want." She looked around the workshop at the high-tech equipment, the laser alignment tools, and the expensive diagnostic computers. "You guys have all the tools in the world, but you stop listening to the engine. You trust the computer more than you trust your own hands." The lead mechanic nodded slowly, shamefaced. "She's right, boss. We relied on the data. The data said the sensor was fine. The data was lying." Sterling looked at the ground, processing this. It was a harsh lesson in corporate arrogance versus practical skill. The silence stretched out, but it wasn't tense anymore. It was reflective. The sound of the rain against the windows seemed to have softened. Matching the mood inside, Sterling took a deep breath and straightened his tie. He looked at Alina, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time since she walked into his office days ago. He saw a future he hadn't planned for, but one he suddenly realized he desperately needed. "The bet," Sterling said softly. "I said if you fixed it, the internship was over." Elena's eyes narrowed slightly, a flash of defensive anger appearing for the first time. "I remember." Sterling looked at the car, then back at her, and for the first time, a genuine, if slightly awkward smile touched his lips. "Well," he said, "I'm a man of my word. Your internship is definitely over." The air in the workshop seemed to stand still as Sterling's words hung there. "Your internship is definitely over." Lena felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She had expected this. She had braced herself for it, actually. Men like Sterling didn't like being proven wrong, especially by someone they considered beneath them. It was a classic move. Let the hero win, then push them out the door to keep the ego intact. She kept her face neutral, refusing to let him see the disappointment. She straightened her spine and prepared herself to gather her few things from the break room. She would leave with her head high, knowing she had beaten the impossible engine. even if it meant losing her chance at the career she dreamed of. "I'll get my badge and clear out my desk," Elena said, her voice steady. She turned to walk toward the lockers, but Sterling stepped in front of her. Blocking her path, he wasn't looking at her with the smug satisfaction she expected. He looked serious, his brow furrowed in deep thought. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, the same paper he had been holding earlier, the one she thought was her termination notice. "I'm not firing you," Elena Sterling said, his voice lower than she had ever heard it. "I'm promoting you." He held the paper out to her. Confused, she took it and unfolded it. It wasn't a pink slip. It was a contract. A new contract. Her eyes scanned the document, skipping over the legal jargon until she saw the numbers in the title at the top. Her breath hitched in her throat. The document read Lead Engineer Hyperion Project. And below that, a salary figure that had more zeros than she had ever seen in her life. She looked up, blinking rapidly, sure she was misreading something. What? What is this? "A reality check for me," Sterling said, sighing heavily. He ran a hand through his hair, looking tired but sincere. "I realized something while listening to that engine run. We have a room full of graduates from the best engineering schools in the country. Men with master's degrees and doctorates who couldn't get that car to start. But you felt the problem? You listened to it. You fixed it with a piece of scrap metal and a gut feeling that was actually based on a deep, terrifying amount of knowledge." He gestured toward the car, which was now surrounded by mechanics taking photos and examining the simple fix she had implemented. "I thought I was buying a company with the best technology. I forgot that a company is just people. And I almost threw away the best person I had because she didn't dress the part or have the right diploma on the wall." Elena looked back at the paper. Her hands were trembling slightly. "But I don't have a degree. I just have experience from a garage." "Experience that just saved this project," Sterling corrected her. "I don't care where you learned it. I care that you can do it. I need someone who isn't afraid to tell the computer it's wrong. I need someone who isn't afraid to tell me I'm wrong. Can you do that?" Elena looked at the man standing in front of her. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a humbled leader who was desperate to save his company. She realized this wasn't just about fixing an engine anymore. This was about changing the way things were done. She looked at the other mechanics, who were watching her with anticipation. They were waiting for her to say yes. They wanted to learn from her. She wasn't just an outsider anymore. She was the one who had cracked the code. "Yes," Elena said, the word coming out strong and clear. "I can do that." Sterling extended his hand. It wasn't a hand offered to a subordinate, but a hand offered to an equal. Elena took it. His grip was firm, but hers was stronger, calloused from years of turning wrenches. "Welcome to the team, engineer," Sterling said. He clapped her on the shoulder and turned back to the room, clapping his hands to get everyone's attention. "All right, listen up. The showcase is tomorrow morning. I want this car detailed. I want the diagnostics run one more time. And I want to make sure every bolt on this car is torqued to specification. Elena is in charge of the floor now. If she asks for something, you move." The room erupted not in the polite applause of a boardroom, but in the cheers and whistles of the shop floor. The lead mechanic walked over and handed her a grease rag, nodding his head in respect. "Nice work, kid. Now, don't get us all fired, okay?" Elena smiled, a genuine bright smile that lit up her face. She took the rag and wiped the remaining grease from her hands. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Elena directed the team with a natural authority. She didn't bark orders. She explained things. She showed the senior technicians where the vibration faults were hiding. She taught the younger apprentices how to listen to the engine, not just look at the screens. The atmosphere in the workshop had completely transformed. The fear was gone, replaced by a buzzing energy of collaboration and respect. Late that night, long after Sterling had gone home and the other shifts had clocked out, Elena stayed behind. The workshop was quiet again, save for the hum of the ventilation fans. She stood alone in front of the Hyperion. It was gleaming under the spotlights, looking like a spaceship ready for launch. She reached out and patted the side of the engine block. warm from the final test run. It was a funny thing, she thought. 2 days ago, she was invisible. She was just the girl who fetched coffee. Now, she held the future of the company in her hands. She had dared to touch the machine, to understand it, and to trust herself when no one else would. She grabbed her bag and headed for the door, flipping off the workshop lights as she went. The silver car sat in the dark, silent and perfect. It wasn't an impossible engine anymore. It was just an engine. And she was just a mechanic who happened to be a genius. As she walked out into the cool night air, leaving the smell of oil and grease behind her for a few hours of sleep, Alina felt a lightness in her step. The world hadn't changed, but her place in it had. She knew that tomorrow, when she walked onto that stage, in front of the cameras and the investors, she wouldn't just be representing Sterling Automotive. She would be representing every person who had ever been underestimated. Every person who had been told they weren't smart enough, or rich enough, or important enough. She got into her own small, beat-up car and started the engine. It sputtered once before catching, the sound rough and familiar compared to the smooth purr of the Hyperion. She laughed to herself and pulled out of the parking lot. She had a big day tomorrow, but she wasn't worried. She knew how to fix things. And more importantly, she knew how to fix people. Under the harsh lights of the industry, she had found her spark, and she wasn't about to let it fade out.